Have you ever wondered what happens when an enemy realizes they cannot understand a single word being spoken around them, even though victory depends on breaking that code? Before we dive into this incredible story, I need your help. Comment below telling me where you're watching this from, and please hit that subscribe button. This channel depends on your support to keep bringing you these hidden stories that changed the course of history. Now, let's continue. The winter of 1943 brought with it a silence more terrifying than any artillery barrage the German forces had ever experienced. Not the silence of death, but something far more unsettling, a silence of comprehension. A void where understanding should exist. In the frozen forests of Belgium, where the Battle of the Bulge would soon carve its name into history, German intelligence officers sat hunched over radio equipment, their faces growing paler with each passing hour. They were listening to voices, American voices, but the words made no sense whatsoever. Oberleutnant Friedrich Hauser had broken codes from 7 different nations. His expertise in cryptography had earned him the Iron Cross and the respect of the entire Wehrmacht intelligence division. He spoke 5 languages fluently and could recognize dozens more. But on this December morning, as he adjusted the frequency dial on his Tornister-Empfänger radio set, he heard something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The voices were clear, the signal was strong, but the language was utterly alien. He called over Hauptmann Klaus Dietrich, another linguistic expert who had spent years in the signals intelligence unit. Together, they listened. The rhythm was unlike anything in their extensive experience. It was not English, though English words occasionally punctuated the stream. It was not a European language. The phonetic structures, the tonal qualities, the grammatical flow, all of it existed outside their comprehensive understanding of world languages. "What are they saying?" Hauser asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Dietrich shook his head slowly, his eyes fixed on the radio speaker, as if staring harder might somehow unlock the mystery. "I've never heard anything like this in my entire career. This is not a code. This is a language. But it is no language I have ever encountered." The transmissions continued throughout the day, short bursts of communication, clearly military in nature. Coordinates were being relayed. Orders were being given. Troop movements were being discussed. The German officers could sense the operational nature of the conversations, could hear the urgency, the precision, the tactical intent, but they could not understand a single substantive word. By nightfall, the intelligence reports reached the desk of General Major Wilhelm Hoffmann at divisional headquarters in St. Vith. He read the transcripts, studied the phonetic notations his linguists had painstakingly recorded, and felt something he had not experienced since the early days of the war: genuine confusion. His intelligence apparatus, which had successfully intercepted and decoded Allied communications for years, had suddenly gone blind. "Bring me someone who can explain this," Hoffmann ordered. "I want to know what language this is, where it comes from, and how we can break it." The response from his staff was unprecedented. They could not identify the language, not from any reference materials, not from any linguistic database, not from any prisoner interrogation. The Americans had deployed something entirely unexpected. What the German intelligence network did not know, could not know, was that they were listening to Diné-Bizard, the Navajo language, a language spoken by fewer than 50,000 people in the entire world, most of them concentrated in the American Southwest, in the vast desert territories of Arizona, New Mexico, and Utah. A language with no written form used by the military, no dictionaries available to foreign powers, no linguistic relatives that might provide a key to understanding. A language that had evolved in complete isolation from European linguistic traditions, shaped by a culture and worldview so fundamentally different that even its basic conceptual structures were alien to Western ears. The man responsible for this linguistic weapon was Philip Johnston, a civil engineer and the son of missionaries who had spent his childhood among the Navajo people. He had grown up speaking Diné Bizard as fluently as English, had absorbed the culture, understood the unique properties of the language. In 1942, he had approached the Marine Corps with a radical proposal. Use Navajo speakers as code talkers, not to create a code, but to use the language itself as an unbreakable communication system. The Marine Corps had been skeptical at first. They had used code talkers from various Native American tribes during World War I, including Choctaw speakers, with some success. But the scale of modern warfare, the complexity of military communications, the speed required in combat situations, all of this demanded something more robust. Johnston assured them that Navajo was different. The language was incredibly complex, with tonal distinctions, grammatical structures, and a vocabulary so specific to Navajo culture that translation was often impossible. More importantly, outside of the Navajo Nation, virtually no one spoke it. There were no published grammars accessible to foreign powers, no Rosetta Stone for enemy cryptographers to study. In May of 1942, the first 29 Navajo recruits arrived at Camp Elliott in San Diego, California. They were young men from the reservation, many of whom had attended government boarding schools where they had been punished for speaking their native language, where teachers had beaten them for refusing to abandon their cultural identity. Now, that same language, that same cultural identity, was being recognized as a weapon that might help win the war. The task before them was immense. They needed to create a military vocabulary in a language that had no words for tanks, aircraft carriers, bombs, or military ranks. The solution was ingenious. They used the natural world, the animals, plants, and elements that form the foundation of Navajo cosmology. A tank became a chidi-na-na-i, a tortoise car. A battleship became a lotso, a whale. A fighter plane became a dahetihi, a hummingbird. A dive bomber became a guinea, a chicken hawk. Commanding officers became bikea-bika, the land's guardian. The entire military lexicon was rebuilt using the metaphorical and descriptive genius of the Navajo language. But it was more than just vocabulary. The Navajo language itself provided layers of security. Verbs in Diné Bizard change form depending on the shape and nature of the object being discussed. The language requires speakers to express constant awareness of motion, direction, and relationship. These grammatical features made the language nearly impossible to learn quickly, especially for adults whose brains had been shaped by entirely different linguistic structures. A German cryptographer listening to Navajo was not just hearing unfamiliar words. He was hearing an entirely different way of organizing reality, an entirely different cognitive framework. By August of 1942, the first Navajo code talkers were deployed to the Pacific Theater, where they would prove their worth at Guadalcanal. The system worked flawlessly. Messages that would take hours to encode and decode using traditional cryptographic methods could be transmitted and understood in seconds using Navajo. A 3-line English message that required 30 minutes to encrypt with conventional machines could be spoken in Navajo, transmitted and understood in 20 seconds. But the European theater presented different challenges. The Germans were more technically sophisticated than the Japanese in signals intelligence. Their cryptographic departments were larger, better funded, more experienced. The Enigma machine, the Wehrmacht's encryption device, was considered unbreakable. German intelligence officers had successfully compromised numerous Allied codes throughout the war. When Navajo code talkers were deployed to Europe in preparation for D-Day, the Germans were confident they would break this new code, just as they had broken others. Oberleutnant Hauser was assigned to lead the effort. He assembled a team of the best linguists, cryptographers, and intelligence analysts available. They recorded hundreds of hours of Navajo transmissions. They analyzed frequency patterns, tried to identify repeated phrases, looked for any structure that might provide an entry point. They consulted with academic linguists, with anthropologists who had studied Native American cultures, with missionaries who had worked in North America. Nothing worked. The phonetic complexity alone was staggering. Navajo contains sounds that do not exist in any European language. The glottal stop, the ejective consonants, the tonal variations, all of these were difficult for German ears to even perceive, let alone reproduce. Hauser's team tried to create a phonetic alphabet, but they could not agree on how many distinct sounds the language contained. Some analysts heard 40 consonants, others heard 60. The vowels seemed to shift, depending on context in ways that defied European linguistic categories. One of Hauser's colleagues, a linguistics professor from Heidelberg University named Dr. Ernst Vogler, spent 3 months analyzing Navajo transmissions. His report, filed in March of 1944, was remarkable in its honesty. This language operates according to principles fundamentally alien to Indo-European linguistic structures, he wrote. The verb system alone would require years of study to master. The language requires speakers to constantly specify information about motion, shape, and consistency that European languages treat as optional. More critically, the language appears to have developed in complete isolation from any linguistic family with which we are familiar. There are no cognates, no loan words, no structural similarities that might provide a key to understanding. In my professional opinion, this code is unbreakable through conventional cryptographic analysis. The only way to understand these transmissions would be to capture a speaker and compel him to translate, and even then, the speed and complexity of battlefield communications would make real-time intelligence gathering nearly impossible. The report was filed and largely ignored by higher command. The German military leadership could not accept that a primitive tribal language, as they dismissively called it, could defeat the sophisticated intelligence apparatus of the Reich. They ordered the analysis to continue. By the time Allied forces landed in Normandy on June 6, 1944, Navajo code talkers were operating across all major American communication networks in the European theater. They coordinated the movements of the 1st, 4th, and 29th Infantry Divisions. They relayed artillery coordinates during the brutal hedgerow fighting in Normandy. They transmitted orders during the race across France, and the Germans never broke the code. The frustration within German intelligence reached critical levels. Officers who had built their careers on signals intelligence found themselves completely blind to American tactical communications. They could intercept the transmissions. They could record them. They could analyze the signal strength and determine approximate locations, but they could not understand the content. It was as if the Americans had found a way to make their communications invisible, while simultaneously broadcasting them clearly over open channels. In the Hürtgen forest, during the bitter autumn fighting of 1944, a German signals intelligence unit managed to capture recording equipment and transcripts from an American forward observation post that had been overrun. The documents included both English translations and Navajo transmissions. It was the breakthrough Hauser had been waiting for. He now had a key, a way to match the alien sounds with their English meanings. But even with the transcripts, comprehension remained elusive. The Navajo words were not simple substitutions for English words. They were metaphorical, contextual, dependent on shared cultural knowledge. A transmission might say, "The hummingbirds are approaching the whale," and the English translation would read, "Fighter aircraft are engaging the battleship." Without understanding the entire conceptual system, without knowing that certain animals represented certain military equipment, the Navajo transmissions remained meaningless. Worse, the code talkers had been trained to add an additional layer of security. For particularly sensitive communications, they used a substitution cipher within the Navajo language itself. The Navajo word for ant might represent the letter A, the word for bear might represent B, and so on. So even if a German cryptographer somehow learned Navajo, he would still face an additional encryption layer that could be changed at will. As 1944 turned into 1945 and the Allied armies pushed deeper into Germany, the Navajo transmissions continued uninterrupted. They coordinated the crossing of the Rhine. They managed the complex logistics of the drive toward Berlin. They transmitted targeting data and battlefield intelligence. And through it all, German intelligence remained in the dark. In the final months of the war, as Germany collapsed and its military infrastructure crumbled, Allied intelligence officers began capturing German signals intelligence facilities. What they found in those abandoned bunkers and command posts told a story of profound frustration and intellectual defeat. Filing cabinets filled with thousands of pages of transcribed Navajo transmissions, walls covered with charts attempting to map phonetic patterns, notebooks containing wild theories about the origin of the language, some speculating it was an artificially constructed code, others suggesting it might be related to obscure Asiatic languages, still others convinced it was some form of ancient European dialect that had somehow survived in isolation. In a bunker outside of Aachen, American forces discovered a small room that had been dedicated entirely to the Navajo problem. The walls were covered with photographs of Native Americans, maps of the American Southwest, and linguistic diagrams that looked more like abstract art than serious analysis. On one wall, someone had written in German, in neat, precise letters, "The language of ghosts. We can hear them, but we cannot understand them. They speak, and we are deaf." Captain Robert Yellowhorse, a Navajo code talker who had served with the 9th Army during the push into Germany, was brought to the bunker by American intelligence officers who wanted his perspective. He stood in that room for a long time, reading the German notes, studying the desperate attempts to decode his language. When he finally spoke, his words were quiet, but carried enormous weight. "My grandfather told me that our language was given to us by the holy people to protect us. He said it would keep us safe even in the darkest times. I did not understand what he meant until now." The story of what German soldiers actually said when they first encountered Navajo code talkers in combat is fragmented, pieced together from captured documents, prisoner interrogations, and post-war interviews. But certain accounts stand out for their visceral detail and emotional honesty. Unteroffizier Hans Becker, a radio operator with the 352nd Volksgrenadier Division, was captured near Bastogne during the Battle of the Bulge. During his interrogation at a prisoner of war camp in Belgium, he described his experience with unusual candor. "We knew the Americans were talking. We could hear them clearly on our receivers, but it was like listening to spirits. That is the only way I can describe it. Not human voices speaking human language, but something else, something ancient. We had broken British codes, French codes, even some American codes. But this was different. It made us feel helpless in a way that no amount of artillery or air superiority ever did. We were fighting an enemy we could not even understand." Another account came from Hauptmann Georg Richter, an intelligence officer who survived the war and was interviewed by American military historians in 1953. He had spent the last year of the war specifically tasked with breaking what the Germans called the Indian Code. His description was even more unsettling. "I began to dream in that language, even though I did not understand it. The sounds would repeat in my sleep. My colleagues and I, we started to go a little mad with it. We would hear the transmissions during the day, record them, analyze them for hours, and then at night, those sounds would come back. We tried everything. We consulted with anthropologists, linguists, even a professor who had studied indigenous cultures of the Americas. Nothing helped. One of my analysts, a brilliant man named Steiner, who had decoded Soviet communications with remarkable success, he had a breakdown. He became convinced the language was supernatural, that the Americans had somehow weaponized ancient magic. Of course, that was nonsense born of exhaustion and desperation, but it shows you the psychological effect it had on us. We were not just failing to break a code. We were confronting the limits of our own understanding, the possibility that there were things in the world we could never comprehend. The psychological dimension of the Navajo Code cannot be overstated. For the German military, which prided itself on technological and intellectual superiority, the inability to break this code represented a fundamental challenge to their worldview. They had conquered most of Europe. They had developed some of the most advanced weapon systems in the world. Their scientists and engineers were considered the finest on Earth. And yet, a group of Native American men from the Arizona desert had created a communication system that rendered all that sophistication useless. Private First Class Thomas Begay, a code talker who served with the 4th Infantry Division, recalled an incident near the German border in February of 1945. We had set up a communications post in an abandoned farmhouse. The fighting had moved past us, but we could still hear artillery in the distance. I was transmitting coordinates for a supply convoy when I noticed movement near the tree line. A German soldier, young, maybe 19 or 20. He was wounded, probably separated from his unit. He did not attack. He just stood there watching me. I kept transmitting, speaking in Navajo, and I saw his face change. He looked terrified, not of me as a soldier, but of the language itself, like he was hearing something that should not exist. Eventually, some of our infantry came up and took him prisoner, but I have never forgotten the look on his face. It was not the fear of death, it was something deeper, the fear of the incomprehensible. The strategic impact of the Navajo code talkers in the European theater has been somewhat overshadowed by their more famous service in the Pacific, where they were credited with saving countless lives at Iwo Jima, Okinawa, and other brutal island campaigns. But in Europe, their contribution was equally vital. During the Battle of the Bulge, when German forces nearly succeeded in splitting the Allied lines, Navajo code talkers maintained secure communications that allowed American commanders to coordinate the defense and eventual counterattack. In the chaotic winter fighting, when traditional codes were too slow and open communications too risky, the Navajo language provided the speed and security necessary for effective command and control. Major General Maxwell Taylor, commander of the 101st Airborne Division during the Siege of Bastogne, later wrote in his memoirs about the importance of secure communications during that desperate battle. We were surrounded, outnumbered, low on ammunition and medical supplies. The weather had grounded our air support. Everything depended on getting accurate information to headquarters and receiving clear orders in return. The Navajo code talkers made that possible. I did not fully appreciate their contribution at the time. I simply knew that when my communications officer told me a message had been transmitted securely, I could trust it absolutely. Only later did I learn about the extraordinary system that made that security possible. The code talkers themselves were often unaware of the broader impact of their work. They did their jobs, transmitted their messages, moved with the front lines, and rarely learned whether the intelligence they relayed led to successful operations. They faced the same dangers as any combat soldier: enemy fire, artillery barrages, aerial bombardment, with the added burden of knowing they carried irreplaceable linguistic knowledge. If a code talker was killed or captured, the entire communications security system could be compromised. To prevent this, code talkers were often assigned bodyguards, usually Marines or Army soldiers, tasked with protecting them in combat. These bodyguards had two responsibilities: keep the code talker alive, and if capture seemed imminent, ensure that the code talker did not fall into enemy hands. It was a grim calculus of war. The code was more valuable than any individual life, even the lives of the men who spoke it. Private First Class Harold Foster, a Marine assigned to protect code talker Samuel Holliday during the Pacific Campaign, later transferred to Europe, where he continued in the same role protecting code talker John Kinsel. In an interview conducted in 1997, Foster described the weight of that responsibility. "I was 21 years old, and I had been given orders that I might have to kill the man I was supposed to protect. That is what it came down to. If the Germans were about to capture him, I was supposed to make sure they did not take him alive." We never talked about it directly, John and I, but we both knew. Sometimes I would catch him looking at me, and I knew he was wondering if I would do it. If the moment came, would I pull the trigger? I'm glad I never had to find out, but I think about it still. The war asked impossible things of all of us. The German military, despite their failure to break the code, did attempt other methods to counter it. There were reports, never fully confirmed, of German intelligence trying to locate and capture Navajo speakers. Some accounts suggest that German agents in the United States, operating before America entered the war, had been tasked with gathering information about Native American languages. If true, these efforts bore no fruit. The Navajo Nation was remote, isolated, and deeply protective of its cultural secrets. Even if German agents had somehow managed to learn basic Navajo, they would have been years away from the level of fluency necessary to understand rapid military communications filled with specialized vocabulary and coded terminology. There were also attempts at deception. In several instances, German forces tried to broadcast false messages in what they thought sounded like Navajo, hoping to confuse American units or disrupt communications. These attempts were laughably unsuccessful. The fake transmissions were immediately recognized as fraudulent, not only because the words were gibberish, but because the fundamental phonetic structure was wrong. It would be like trying to fake French by randomly stringing together sounds and hoping native speakers would be fooled. The Navajo code talkers could instantly distinguish authentic transmissions from enemy interference. One particularly interesting account comes from Feldwebel Otto Krebs, a German radio operator captured near Cologne in March of 1945. During his interrogation, he described an incident that revealed the depth of German confusion about the Navajo code. "We captured an American radio," Krebs reported. "My commanding officer was convinced that if we could use American equipment, we might be able to trick their communications network. We tried to mimic the sounds we had recorded. We had one man, Schmidt, who was talented with languages and accents. He listened to hours of recordings and tried to reproduce the sounds. When he finally attempted to broadcast, we thought we had done it perfectly. Within 30 seconds, the American response came back, and our translator told us what they said. 'Nice try, Jerry. Your accent needs work.' They were mocking us. They knew immediately it was fake. That was when I truly understood we were facing something we could never defeat." As the European War drew to its conclusion in the spring of 1945, the Navajo Code talkers continued their work even as the strategic situation became chaotic. They transmitted messages during the crossing of the Rhine, the liberation of concentration camps, the link-up with Soviet forces at the Elbe River. Their final transmissions in Europe came in early May as German resistance collapsed and the surrender was negotiated. Code talker William Brown was transmitting from a forward position near the Czech border when he received word that the war in Europe was over. His description of that moment, recorded in an oral history project decades later, carried profound emotional weight. "I sent the message in Navajo. The war has ended, Germany has surrendered, and then I just sat there with the radio silent. I thought about everything we had been through. The battles, the fear, the friends we had lost. I thought about my grandfather back on the reservation and how he had taught me our language when I was a child, how he had told me our words were sacred, that they connected us to the holy people and to the land. I never imagined those words would travel across an ocean and help defeat an enemy my grandfather had never heard of. But that is what happened. Our language, which the government had tried to erase, which teachers had punished us for speaking, that language had helped win a world war. The post-war period brought a strange kind of silence for the Navajo code talkers. Their work was immediately classified. They were ordered not to discuss what they had done, not even with their families. While other veterans came home and told stories of their service, the code talkers remained quiet, bound by oaths of secrecy. The government feared that if the Navajo code became public knowledge, it could not be used in future conflicts. So these men, who had made extraordinary contributions to the war effort, returned to the reservation and resumed their lives without recognition or acknowledgement. Many struggled with the transition. They had served their country with distinction, had been treated as valuable assets during the war, and then returned to a nation that still subjected Native Americans to discrimination and marginalization. The irony was bitter. They had used their language to protect America, but America still ran boarding schools designed to eliminate that same language. They had fought for freedom abroad, while their own people lacked full civil rights at home. Code talker Samuel Tso, in an interview conducted in the 1980s, spoke about this contradiction with quiet dignity. "When I came back from the war, I could not tell anyone what I had done. My family knew I had been in the Marines, but they did not know about the code. I went back to work as a silversmith, lived my life on the reservation. Sometimes I would hear people talking about the war, about the great victories, the brave soldiers. I would stay quiet. It was not until many years later, when the code was declassified, that I could finally tell my children what their father had done. By then I was an old man, but I saw the pride in their eyes when they learned about the code talkers, and I thought maybe it was worth the wait. The code remained classified until 1968, 23 years after the end of World War II. Even then, full public recognition came slowly. It was not until the 1980s and 90s that the code talkers began to receive widespread acknowledgement for their contributions. Medals were awarded, monuments were erected, books were written. The story of the Navajo code talkers became part of the national narrative about World War II. But by that time, many of the original code talkers had passed away. Of the approximately 400 men who served as Navajo code talkers during World War II, only a handful lived long enough to see full public recognition of their service. They were old men by then, grandfathers and great-grandfathers, many of them still living on the Navajo Nation, still speaking the language that had once been a weapon of war. In 2001, the original 29 Navajo code talkers, the men who had developed the code at Camp Elliott in 1942, were awarded Congressional Gold Medals. President George W. Bush presided over the ceremony in the Capitol Rotunda. Only 5 of the original 29 were still alive to receive their medals in person. The others were represented by family members who accepted the medals on their behalf. During that ceremony, one of the surviving code talkers, John Brown Jr., spoke briefly about his experience. He was 91 years old, frail but clear-eyed. Our language was sacred. It was given to us by the holy people to sustain us, to connect us to our land and our ancestors. When the Marines asked us to use it to fight, we did not hesitate. We understood that we could help protect our homeland, protect our families, protect the freedom that all people deserve. The code was never broken because our language is strong. It has survived centuries of hardship, survived attempts to destroy it, and it will survive long after all of us are gone. That is what the Germans could never understand. They were trying to break a code, but we were speaking the truth of our people, and the truth cannot be broken. The German soldiers who encountered the Navajo Code during World War II experienced something that went beyond military defeat. They encountered a fundamental limit to their understanding, a reminder that the world was larger and more complex than their ideologies had assumed. They had believed in the superiority of Western civilization, in the power of technology and science to solve all problems. And then they heard voices speaking a language that predated their entire civilization, a language rooted in a landscape and culture they had never imagined, and they were helpless before it. In the decades after the war, as historians and linguists studied the Navajo Code, they came to appreciate its elegant sophistication. It was not just that the language was unknown to the Axis powers. It was that the language itself possessed qualities that made it ideal for secure communications. The complexity of the verb system meant that a speaker had to have deep intuitive knowledge to use it correctly. It could not be learned from a phrasebook or a dictionary. The metaphorical vocabulary meant that even if someone somehow learned basic Navajo, they would still need to understand the cultural context to decode military messages. The lack of cognates with any other language meant there were no linguistic bridges that could provide understanding. But perhaps most importantly, the Navajo Code worked because it was rooted in something deeper than military strategy. It was rooted in the survival of a people who had endured centuries of colonization, forced relocation, cultural suppression, and marginalization. The Navajo language survived because the Navajo people fought to keep it alive, even when the United States government actively tried to eliminate it. When that same government finally recognized the value of what it had tried to destroy, the language was ready. It had been preserved by grandmothers and grandfathers who refused to let it die, by children who spoke it in secret when teachers were not listening, by communities that understood their language was not just a means of communication, but the embodiment of their identity and worldview. The German soldiers who listened to those transmissions were hearing the voice of a people who had survived their own apocalypse and emerged with their culture intact. They were hearing the sound of resilience, the sound of a language that had adapted and persisted through conditions that would have destroyed lesser traditions. They were hearing something that could not be conquered because it had already survived every attempt at conquest. In the forests of Belgium, in the bunkers of Normandy, in the ruins of German cities, those voices continued speaking, coordinating the movements of armies, directing the flow of supplies, transmitting the intelligence that would bring the war to its conclusion. And the Germans listened, recorded, analyzed, and remained forever deaf to the meaning. There is a Navajo word, hojo, that has no direct English translation. It means harmony, beauty, balance, the proper order of all things. It is a central concept in Navajo philosophy, the goal toward which all life should move. The code talkers carried that concept with them into war. They fought not out of hatred or vengeance, but to restore balance, to protect their families and their land, to ensure that future generations could continue to live in Hojho. When the war ended and they returned home, many of them participated in the Enemy Way ceremony, a traditional Navajo ritual designed to restore harmony after exposure to violence and death. The ceremony helped cleanse them of the trauma they had experienced, helped reintegrate them into the peaceful rhythms of reservation life. It was a recognition that war had taken them out of balance, and that balance needed to be restored. The story of what German soldiers said when they faced Navajo warriors is ultimately a story about two very different kinds of power. The Germans possessed industrial might, technological sophistication, and military discipline. The Navajo possessed something that could not be measured or quantified. They possessed a language that carried within it the accumulated wisdom of countless generations, a language that had been shaped by one of the harshest environments on Earth, a language that embodied a way of seeing the world that was fundamentally at odds with the mechanistic, reductionist thinking of modern warfare. In that collision between the ancient and the modern, between the indigenous and the imperial, the ancient prevailed, not through superior firepower or better tactics, but through the simple fact of incomprehensibility. The Germans could not understand because their entire intellectual framework gave them no tools for understanding. They were like men trying to see color who had been born blind. The sensory apparatus necessary for perception was simply absent. Today, the Navajo language faces new threats. Fewer young people speak it fluently. English dominates education, media, and commerce, even on the reservation. The forces of globalization and cultural homogenization that once used boarding schools and forced assimilation now work more subtly through television, internet, and economic pressure. The language that defeated the German military is slowly losing ground to the quiet erosion of modernity. But there are efforts to preserve it. Language immersion schools, cultural programs, recording projects that capture the voices of elders before they pass away. And always, there is the memory of the code talkers, the living proof that this language has power, that it matters, that it contributed something irreplaceable to history. The German intelligence officers who spent the war trying to break the Navajo code are all gone now. The bunkers where they worked have been demolished or converted to other uses. The filing cabinets filled with transcribed transmissions have been archived in obscure military collections. But somewhere in those archives, those recordings still exist. The voices of young Navajo men speaking their language, transmitting coordinates, relaying orders, conducting the business of war. To a listener today, without translation, those voices would sound exactly as they sounded to the Germans. Beautiful, mysterious, and utterly incomprehensible. And perhaps that is the final lesson of the Navajo code talkers. That there are things in this world that cannot be conquered, cannot be decoded, cannot be reduced to formulas and systems. That some kinds of knowledge can only be understood from within, can only be accessed through cultural initiation and lived experience. That diversity, linguistic, cultural, cognitive diversity, is not just something to be tolerated, but something that provides genuine strategic advantage, genuine power. The Germans learned this lesson too late. They heard the voices of the Navajo warriors and could not understand them. And in that failure of understanding, they encountered something more powerful than any weapon. They encountered the limits of their own certainty, the boundaries of their own knowledge, the existence of worlds they could never access. The voices continue, in ceremonies on the reservation, in language classes, in the memories of the few surviving code talkers and their descendants, speaking of harmony and balance, speaking of survival and resistance, speaking in a language that once helped save the world and that might yet save itself, if those who carry it find the strength to keep it alive. The code was never broken, and if we are wise, it never will be. Seek God. Follow Jesus Christ. In times of darkness, when the world seems incomprehensible and the future uncertain, remember that there are powers greater than any human strength, wisdom deeper than any human knowledge. The code talkers knew this. They carried their faith with them into battle, just as they carried their language, and both sustained them through the worst that war could offer. In your own life, whatever battles you face, remember that some things cannot be decoded or conquered. Some things can only be accepted, embraced, lived. Find that which is sacred in your own life. Protect it, nurture it, let it guide you home.